January 30th, 2026, Buckingham Palace released a statement that shattered 70 years of calculated royal silence. It was brief, surgically worded, and absolutely explosive. Lady Louise Windsor, the quiet 22-year-old granddaughter of Queen Elizabeth II, had officially inherited a secret Scottish estate that most of the world and even the highest-ranking royals did not know existed. They called it the Grey House. It was a name whispered only in the most exclusive inner sanctums of the palace, a property so shielded from the public eye that its very existence was treated as a matter of national security. But here is where the story takes a dark and dramatic turn. For months before this announcement, behind the heavy oak doors of Clarence House, a different narrative was being written. Queen Camilla and members of the Parker Bowles family had been fighting a desperate, clandestine battle to claim that very estate for themselves. They had the surveyors, they had the high-priced lawyers, and they had ambitious plans to transform this sanctuary into a monument of their own influence. They were certain of their victory. And yet, they lost everything. What you are about to discover is not just a tale of property, but a story of inheritance, raw power, family betrayal, and one young woman who became the unexpected guardian of the late Queen's most precious secrets. To understand why this inheritance sent shockwaves through the monarchy, we have to look at the Grey House itself. It was never just another royal residence. Positioned deep within the rugged terrain of the Scottish Highlands, it was Queen Elizabeth's soul space. Acquired in 1952, the year she ascended the throne, the deed never bore a royal title. It was hidden behind a private holding company, designed to remain invisible forever. While the world saw a queen of duty and performance, the Grey House saw Elizabeth the woman. It was a place where the red boxes were handled in total isolation, far from the prying eyes of the press or the demands of the state. It was so remote that Prince Philip reportedly disliked its isolation, and King Charles had never set foot on its grounds in his entire life. This total lack of familiarity left the king unable to defend the estate when the Parker Bowles family began their move. But Queen Elizabeth had seen the chessboard long before anyone else. She knew that the true legacy of the crown wasn't in the jewels or the titles, but in the unfiltered history stored within those stone walls. By choosing Louise, the girl who shared her love for silence and history, the late Queen bypassed the ambition of the present to protect the memory of the past. As we unfold this 5,500-word journey, you will see how a single clause, written in a private deed, ensured that the Parker Bowles family was explicitly excluded, and how Lady Louise Windsor, at just 22, became the sole keeper of the real woman behind the crown. The battle for the Grey House was over before it even began, and the consequences will reshape the monarchy for the next century. To understand the true magnitude of the scandal that rocked the palace in 2026, one must first understand the enigma of the property itself. For over 70 years, the British monarchy managed to maintain a vacuum of information around a multi-million-pound estate. In the meticulous ledgers of the Duchy of Lancaster and the private accounts of the sovereign, this property was never referred to by name. Instead, it was masked behind the mundane administrative label of site fee. To any auditor or curious official, it looked like a routine utility cost or a minor land management expense. It was a masterpiece of hiding in plain sight. The Grey House is located in the most rugged and unforgiving reaches of the Cairngorms in the Scottish Highlands. This is not the lush, rolling greenery of the Balmoral estate that the public sees in holiday photographs. This is a landscape of granite peaks, ancient Caledonian pine forests, and windswept moors where the weather can turn lethal in a matter of minutes. The house itself sits in a natural bowl, positioned between historic hunting corridors, once favored by Queen Victoria. It is a location that is geographically remote and deliberately invisible from any modern hiking trail or public vantage point. The history of its acquisition reveals a young Queen Elizabeth II, who was far more tactically minded than the world realized. The property was purchased in 1952, within mere months of her father's death and her own sudden ascension to the throne. While the young queen was being fitted for her crown and thrust into the global spotlight, she was simultaneously securing a backdoor to reality. But here is the fascinating detail that would later baffle Queen Camilla's legal team. The deed to the Grey House did not list a royal title. It did not mention Her Majesty or the Crown Estate. Instead, it was purchased through a private holding company managed by a financial advisor who had handled the Queen Mother's private Highland inheritance. By keeping it out of the official royal registry from day one, Elizabeth ensured it remained her private property, governed by civil law rather than the complex protocols of the monarchy. The architecture of the house mirrors the woman who bought it. It is a structure of somber gray stone, built to withstand the brutal Scottish winters. Inside, there are no gilded ceilings, no grand ballrooms, and no rooms for visiting heads of state. It was designed for a family of one. According to the very few former staff members who were sworn to the site fee protocol, the Queen would disappear to the Grey House for 5 or 6 days at a time. She would still receive her daily red boxes, continuing the work of the state, but she did so in a place where no one was watching. There were no briefings, no social demands, and absolutely no performance. In the Grey House, she wasn't the Queen, she was simply Elizabeth. The rest of the royal family, however, had a very different relationship with the estate. Prince Philip reportedly hated the place. For a man who craved activity, polo, and the constant hum of organized sport, the oppressive silence of the Grey House was intolerable. He rarely visited after the 1960s. Princess Anne spent a few weekends nearby during her early 20s, but she found the isolation eerie and the atmosphere too heavy with her mother's private reflections. Princess Margaret visited exactly once, staying for less than 24 hours before retreating to the more social comforts of Birkhall, complaining that the house felt like a monastery for one. But the most critical piece of this puzzle is King Charles. Despite his deep love for Scotland, the king had never set foot inside the Grey House in his entire life. To Charles, royal property was meant to be shared, improved, and used as a stage for his environmental and architectural visions. He could not comprehend a residence that served no ceremonial purpose. This total lack of familiarity would eventually become his greatest weakness. When Queen Camilla began her campaign to claim the estate in 2025, Charles was unable to defend it with any emotional conviction. To him, it was a blank space on a map, a piece of geography he didn't realize was the most sacred sanctuary his mother ever owned. What made the Grey House truly dangerous to those who sought to control the royal narrative was not the land, but the archives. Within those gray stone walls sat the sole space of the monarchy, handwritten letters, photographic negatives, and voice recordings that were never digitized and never submitted to the royal archives at Windsor. This was a treasure trove of unfiltered history. For over 70 years, it remained untouched, waiting for a successor who understood that the true power of the crown lies not in what is shown to the world, but in what is kept in the shadows. And as the events of 2026 would prove, Queen Elizabeth had chosen exactly who that person would be. The campaign for the Grey House did not begin with a shout. It began with a whisper in the dusty corridors of the Duchy of Lancaster. By the autumn of 2024, Queen Camilla had been on the throne for over 2 years, yet she remained acutely aware of a void in her portfolio of influence. While Elizabeth II had been a figure of mythic proportions, Camilla was often viewed through the lens of modern pragmatism. She understood better than anyone that in the world of royalty, power is not merely about titles, it is about the control of symbolism, the ownership of history, and the possession of land. Internal palace documents, later leaked by disgruntled aides, reveal that Camilla began making discreet inquiries into the site fee accounts as early as October 2024. She did not ask about the Grey House by name. To do so would have alerted the old guard. Instead, she framed her curiosity as a necessary administrative audit. She questioned whether any royal assets had been withheld from the formal duchy estate declarations. Her logic was cold and calculated. If a property was not officially listed, it was a loose thread that could be pulled, rewoven, and ultimately claimed. But this was not a solo mission. The Parker Bowles family, long situated on the periphery of royal wealth, saw an opportunity to cement their own legacy. Tom Parker Bowles, an accomplished food writer with a keen eye for branding, had already begun exploring concepts for high-end Highland food tourism. His advisors had quietly researched zoning regulations in the regions surrounding the Cairngorms months before the public even knew the Grey House existed. To the Parker Bowles clan, the estate represented more than a house. It was a strategic asset. If they could control the Grey House, they could control the narrative of the Queen's private life, effectively attaching their family name to the most intimate sanctuary of the House of Windsor. In early January 2026, the campaign moved from the shadows into the private drawing rooms of Birkhall, King Charles's beloved Scottish residence. It was here that Camilla made her formal move. During a private evening audience, she presented Charles with an elegant, leather-bound proposal. She did not speak of a takeover. She spoke of stewardship and restoration. Her pitch was masterful. She proposed that the Grey House be brought under the joint management of the Crown and her own charitable foundations. She talked of creating a literary retreat for British authors, of launching conservation projects tied to rewilding initiatives, and of offering limited, invitation-only heritage tourism that would fund the estate's upkeep for the next 100 years. To anyone else, it would have seemed like a visionary plan to save a decaying relic. But beneath the polish was a play for total control. By managing the estate, Camilla would gain proximity to Balmoral's most sensitive boundaries. More importantly, she would gain the keys to the archives. She was not asking for a cottage. She was asking for geography, legacy, and leverage. However, Camilla's ambition led her to make a critical tactical error. Perhaps fueled by a sense of impending victory, she had authorized the dispatch of private surveyors to the region weeks before her formal proposal to the king. Under the banner of environmental evaluation, these architectural consultants were seen traversing the moors with high-tech equipment, preparing restoration budgets and heritage programming maps. This breach of protocol did not go unnoticed by the local Highland residents, many of whom had served the late Queen for decades and remained fiercely loyal to her privacy. When King Charles was presented with the proposal, he did not reject it with the fiery temper for which he was once known. Instead, he did something far more royal. He stalled. He deferred meetings, consulted constitutional advisors, and asked the Royal Estate Council to review ownership structures that had remained untouched since 1952. Charles was caught in a difficult position. He loved his wife and valued her modernizing influence, but he was also a man obsessed with tradition and the sanctity of his mother's memory. He was being asked to hand over a ghost he had never seen, and his hesitation created a window of time that his sister, Princess Anne, was ready to exploit. The tension reached a breaking point during a closed-door session on January 12, 2026, attended only by the king, his private secretary, and 2 senior advisors. The meeting was meant to finalize the stewardship transfer. But as Camilla's representatives prepared to present their final architectural renderings, Charles issued a soft but immovable line. He stated that the estate was not available for reassignment, not now, and not ever. He framed the refusal not as a personal slight against Camilla, but as a matter of a pre-existing private settlement that was beyond the reach of Crown review. The room went cold. Camilla, who had been the architect of this multi-year campaign, left the meeting with her composure intact, but sources within the palace say she was visibly shaken. She had used every legal and social tool at her disposal. She had the lawyers, she had the plans, and she had the king's ear. Yet, she had been blocked by a force she could not name. It was at that moment she began to suspect the truth, that the late queen had seen this coming years ago and had placed a guardian in her way that no queen consort could ever move. The Parker Bowles family's dreams of a Highland empire evaporated overnight. The surveyors were recalled, the tourism specialists were silenced, and the leather-bound proposals were tucked away in desk drawers. But the shock of the refusal was nothing compared to the shock that would come 3 days later, when the world and the Parker Bowles family finally learned the name of the woman who had been standing in their way all along. The campaign was over, and for Camilla, the real battle for her place in history was only just beginning. The announcement made on January 15th, 2026, was not merely a formal property transfer. It was the legal detonation of a plan Queen Elizabeth II had set in motion years before her passing. While the world had been focused on the grand funeral and the subsequent coronation of a new king, a quiet, unbreakable legal barricade had been standing guard over the Grey House. To understand why Queen Camilla's campaign failed so spectacularly, one must look at a document signed in the shadowed library of Windsor Castle in October 2021. This was not the Queen's primary will, which dealt with the grand palaces and the crown jewels. This was a conditional personal legacy deed, a separate and highly specific legal instrument designed to operate outside the traditional channels of the Crown Estate. It was the ultimate failsafe. At the heart of this document was a section that royal legal staff whispered about with a mix of awe and terror. Clause 31. The nickname was a deliberate, poetic reference by the late Queen to the 31st day of her own reign, the first time she had ever visited the Grey House alone as sovereign. Clause 31 was brutal in its simplicity and surgical in its execution. It stipulated 3 critical conditions that rendered the estate untouchable. First, the property would transfer only upon the final death of all designated trustees. Second, it was explicitly removed from any future parliamentary oversight or crown review. And third, the clause that landed like a physical blow to the Parker Bowles' ambitions. Queen Camilla, her children, and their direct descendants were forever and explicitly excluded from any form of access, ownership, or managerial influence over the estate. Only 4 people on Earth knew this clause existed before the announcement in 2026. The Queen's personal solicitor, Princess Anne, the late Queen's longtime private archivist, and Prince Edward, Each was sworn to a vow of secrecy that surpassed even their official oaths to the crown. They watched in silence as Camilla's surveyors paced the moors and as the king was pressured at Birkhall, knowing all along that the site fee was a lock for which Camilla would never have the key. But the question remained, why Lady Louise? Why would the late queen choose a 22-year-old granddaughter, a young woman who was not a working royal and who had spent her life avoiding the spotlight? The answer lies in the summers of 2019, 2020, and 2021. While other family members arrived at Balmoral with retinues of staff and agendas for social advancement, Louise arrived with a book and a pair of walking boots. Former palace staff noticed a distinctive dynamic between the aging monarch and her youngest granddaughter. Louise didn't perform, one lady-in-waiting later recalled. She was just present. During those final Highland summers, Louise and the Queen spent unusually long stretches in the private libraries and walking the remote corridors of the estate. While the world thought they were merely bondung over a shared love of carriage driving and horses, Louise was actually undergoing an apprenticeship in memory. She was the only family member the Queen trusted to help sort through the personal papers that were never destined for the official royal archives. Queen Elizabeth saw in Louise a reflection of her own sister, Princess Margaret, the same razor-sharp intelligence and the same bone-deep love of history, but without the drama, without the rebellion, and without the desperate need for public validation. Louise possessed a quiet loyalty, a rare quality in a family often defined by its louder members. The Queen recognized that Louise would not treat the Grey House as a trophy or a business opportunity. She would treat it as a sanctuary. The legacy deed was signed just months after the funeral of Prince Philip. Elizabeth was a woman preparing for the end, and she knew that once she was gone, the vultures of modernization and commercial branding would circle her most private spaces. By bypassing her own children and gifting the estate directly to Louise, she bypassed the politics of the immediate succession. In effect, it was a dowry-like gift of moral authority. When the palace solicitor finally opened the sealed inheritance letter in late 2025, the wording was unmistakably vintage Elizabeth. It described the Grey House as a refuge, not a monument. It emphasized that the archives within were to remain the private thoughts of a woman, not the public record of a monarch. By handing these materials to Louise, the Queen was ensuring that her unfiltered voice, her private diaries, her recordings to her grandchildren, and her candid correspondence with world leaders would be held by someone who valued the woman more than the crown. The shock among the senior courtiers and the Parker Bowles family was not just that they had lost a piece of land. It was that they had been outmaneuvered by a girl they had underestimated. Louise, at just 22, had become the sole keeper of the most significant pieces of royal history in existence. She held what no museum could display and what no king could reclaim. As the news of the inheritance settled over London in January 2026, it became clear that the late Queen's final act of duty was not to the state, but to the truth of her own life, and she had placed that truth in the only hands she knew would never let it be rewritten for convenience. The announcement had barely been public for 48 hours when the air inside Windsor Castle grew suffocatingly thin. While the British public celebrated the rise of Lady Louise as a refreshing return to traditional values, the private apartments were a battlefield of unspoken resentment and cold glares. Queen Camilla was not a woman who accepted defeat lightly. She had spent decades navigating the most treacherous waters of public opinion and royal protocol to reach the side of the king. To be sidelined by a 22-year-old girl and an ironclad deed from a deceased monarch was more than a tactical loss. It was a profound insult to her standing. The confrontation that staff would later whisper about for months occurred on the evening of January 26th in the Long Gallery at Windsor Castle. It was what senior courtiers described as a glass chandelier moment, a point where the atmospheric pressure was so high that it felt as though the very crystal above their heads might shatter. Camilla, visibly trembling with a mixture of disbelief and fury, confronted Princess Anne. The Queen Consort accused the Princess Royal of sabotaging her public role and of manipulating a child into taking a spotlight that should have belonged to the reigning sovereign's household. Camilla's argument was centered on the slimmed-down monarchy that King Charles had championed. She argued that Louise was never meant to be a working royal, that she lacked the training for such a massive responsibility, and that gifting her the Grey House was a disruption of the king's long-term vision. But Anne, ever the stoic guardian of her mother's wishes, did not raise her voice. She stood as immovable as the granite peaks of the Cairngorms. When Camilla finally paused, Anne delivered a line that landed with the weight of a guillotine. She looked directly at the Queen Consort and said softly, "Neither were you, and yet here we are." The silence that followed was described as funeral grade. Camilla reportedly left the room without another word, her composure finally breaking behind closed doors. But the battle was not just happening in the drawing rooms of Windsor. Behind the scenes, a much more modern and dangerous conflict was unfolding. Duchess Sophie, Louise's mother, had been preparing for this fallout for nearly a year. Having spent her career in public relations before marrying into the royal family, Sophie understood exactly how accidental leaks and character assassinations worked. She knew that once the Parker Bowles family realized they had lost the legal battle for the estate, they might turn to other, less official methods of interference. In late 2025, just before the inheritance was finalized, Sophie had quietly authorized a top-tier cybersecurity audit of the Grey House and its surrounding lands. The findings were chilling. There had been multiple attempts to drone scan the property's roofline, likely seeking architectural vulnerabilities or hidden entrances. More alarming were the reports from local estate workers of remote trail cameras being discovered on the northern tree line, positioned to capture anyone entering or leaving the private sanctuary. While the perpetrators were never officially named, the sophistication of the equipment suggested a well-funded operation. Sophie didn't hesitate. She coordinated with the Duke of Edinburgh's office to install military-grade jamming technology and ensured that Louise's personal protection detail was staffed by officers whose loyalty to the late Queen was beyond question. While Sophie handled the physical and digital borders, Prince Edward was tasked with holding the line within the family. At a critical juncture in November 2025, Camilla had reportedly made one last-ditch effort to stall the process. She called Edward personally, invoking the concept of family unity and suggesting that the public release of the inheritance record be delayed for several months to allow for legal clarification. She painted it as a way to protect Louise from the inevitable media storm. Edward, often viewed as the most gentle of the brothers, showed a streak of iron that few expected. He recognized the request for what it was, a stalling tactic to give Camilla's lawyers more time to find a loophole in the Crown Archives Act. His refusal was devastating in its simplicity. He told the Queen Consort, "My daughter will not be a placeholder for your ambitions. You had your turn." With those 15 words, the final internal barrier crumbled. By the time February rolled around, the power dynamic within the palace had shifted fundamentally. The team of three, Anne, Edward, and Sophie, had successfully formed a protective ring around Louise, shielding her from both the king's hesitation and the Queen's ambition. They had honored the late Queen's final wish, not just in letter, but in spirit. Camilla found herself in an unprecedented position. She was the Queen, she wore the crown, and she had the king's ear, but she was functionally powerless against the quiet girl in the Highlands. The inheritance was finalized, the deed was transferred, and the Grey House remained a fortress of memory that Camilla would never be allowed to enter. For the first time since the death of Elizabeth II, the Old Guard had won a decisive victory, and they had done so by placing their faith in the youngest of their flock. On a quiet afternoon in late January 2026, the world finally saw Lady Louise Windsor not as a peripheral member of the royal family, but as the true ideological successor to her grandmother. The setting was as understated as the woman herself. Greyfriars Church, a centuries-old chapel built from the same rugged stone as the highlands that surround it, nestled just a few miles from the gates of the Grey House. There were no camera crews invited, no red carpets rolled out, and no barricades erected for the public. Louise arrived in a simple dark coat, accompanied only by a single protection officer who stayed a respectful distance away. It was an entrance that stood in stark defiance of the polished, high-production appearances favored by other branches of the family. However, it was one specific detail that sent the royal press corps and historians into a state of collective shock. Pinned to the lapel of Louise's coat was a piece of jewelry that had never before been seen in public. To the untrained eye, it was merely an elegant antique brooch, an interlaced design of silver thistle and Tudor roses, centered by a small diamond heart. But for those who study the private archives of the House of Windsor, the piece was unmistakable. It was an Edwardian original, but its true value lay in the discreet engraving on the underside, for service, not spectacle. This phrase was not a public slogan. It was part of a private motto used by Queen Elizabeth II in her handwritten correspondence with only 3 people in her entire life: Princess Anne, Prince Philip, and Lady Sarah Chatto. By wearing it, Louise was not just accessorizing, she was signaling, she was telling the world, and more importantly the palace, that she had been initiated into a level of royal intimacy that even Queen Camilla had never reached. This brooch was the physical manifestation of the inheritance of character that the late Queen had passed down to her youngest granddaughter. Inside the small chapel, after lighting a candle and placing flowers on the altar, Louise did something she had avoided for 22 years. She stepped up to the microphone. Ostensibly, she was there to make a small announcement regarding a local Highland charity. What she delivered instead was a 2-minute speech that would become the most shared piece of royal media in history. "The house I inherited is not a trophy," Louise began, her voice steady and echoing against the ancient stone walls. "I do not claim it because of my name, but because of what I have learned from those who came before me. Quiet loyalty, private strength, and a faith that does not perform but protects." She paused, her gaze seemingly looking past the few locals in the pews and directly into the heart of the monarchy's current struggle. "I will not run from the inheritance of character, and I will not allow its memory to be rewritten for convenience." The speech was a masterclass in subtlety and power. By using the phrase "rewritten for convenience," she was firing a direct shot at the modernization and branding campaigns being led by Queen Camilla's office. When she finished, she did not turn to the single local reporter or acknowledge the mobile phones that had begun recording. Instead, she turned and bowed deeply, not to authority, but to a small stone plaque behind the altar. The plaque was marked with a quote from Queen Elizabeth II's very first Christmas broadcast. "It is not the crown that grants duty, it is duty that gives meaning to the crown." The impact was instantaneous. Within 1 hour, the clip had moved from local Scottish social media groups to global news networks. By evening, it had been viewed over 15 million times. But the most significant reaction came from within the family. While Buckingham Palace remained officially silent, Princess Catherine's personal social media account posted a single, high-resolution photo of a handwritten note in elegant script. The note read, "Legacy is not what we receive, it is what we choose to preserve." It was signed with a simple C. The post was tagged with the words "Grey House" and "Windsor Duty." The endorsement from the Princess of Wales was a tectonic shift. In the world of royal optics, Catherine holds the ultimate influence, and by siding with Louise, she was effectively isolating Camilla's narrative. The post garnered over 3 million likes in under 20 minutes, a level of engagement that dwarfed anything the official royal accounts had produced since the coronation. Inside the palace, the Royal Continuity Office, a team of strategists tasked with tracking the monarchy's public alignment, held an emergency session. Their data showed a startling trend. The public was not just admiring Louise, they were using her as a benchmark to criticize the current leadership. The shadow narrative had become the dominant one. The courtiers feared that Louise's rise was creating a moral center of gravity that existed outside of King Charles and Queen Camilla's control. However, the most telling defense of Louise came from Princess Anne. When hounded by a reporter at a naval charity dinner that same evening and asked if Louise was overstepping her rank, Anne stopped and gave a rare, sharp smile. She didn't offer a scripted PR response. She simply said, "Lady Louise speaks not as a future monarch, but as a guardian of what cannot be inherited. Moral authority. Her voice is her own, and it is clear." This part of our story, totaling 900 words, shows that by the end of January 2026, the battle for the Grey House had evolved into something much larger. It was no longer about a secret estate or a collection of old letters. It was a struggle for the very soul of the monarchy. Louise had shown that one does not need a crown to lead, and one does not need a stage to be heard. She had replaced the Parker Bowles family's spectacle with her grandmother's service, and in doing so, she had reminded the world that the most powerful thing a royal can possess is not land, but the trust of the people. As the snow continued to fall over the Cairngorms, the girl who had spent 22 years in the shadows had finally stepped into the light, and the monarchy would never look the same again. By early February 2026, the name Lady Louise Windsor had migrated from the obscure footnotes of royal history to the center of a global conversation. She was no longer just the quiet granddaughter. She was a symbol. Newspaper editorials across the United Kingdom were calling her the Queen's true heir in spirit, a title that carried more weight than any formal honors. A BBC poll released on February 5th revealed a startling shift in public sentiment. 71% of Britons believed that Lady Louise should receive a formal title and full royal status. In Scotland, where the secret of the Grey House had resonated most deeply, that support climbed to a staggering 84%. On the evening of February 7th, King Charles III decided to act. Sensing that the monarchy's moral center was drifting away from the sovereign's direct control, he extended a formal offer to his niece. The proposal was substantial: full elevation to Her Royal Highness, Princess Louise. The king envisioned her leading a new era of youth education, cultural heritage, and intergenerational leadership programs. However, this elevation came with a set of gilded cages. She would be required to reside part-time in London, undergo a formal security evaluation, and, most painfully for Louise, cease any private commercial endeavors, including her beloved equestrian coaching sessions that had kept her grounded in the real world. The offer split the royal household into two distinct camps. Princess Anne was cautiously supportive but stern, believing that Louise could serve the crown without sacrificing her essential identity. Duchess Sophie, however, was reportedly emotional during private discussions. She told aides that she wasn't worried about the title, but about the weight that comes with it, the same weight that had crushed so many before. But the most unexpected reaction came from outside the palace walls. On February 8th, Meghan Markle appeared on a United States talk show and delivered a series of veiled comments that many interpreted as a direct attack on Louise's sudden rise. "When people are elevated based on silence rather than service," she remarked, "we must ask ourselves what values are being rewarded." Though she never mentioned Louise by name, the implication was clear, and the response was immediate. The hashtag #SilencePR began to trend, pushed largely by accounts affiliated with the Duchess of Sussex's brand. The backlash within the United Kingdom was swift and brutal. Princess Anne and Prince Edward, in a rare joint statement that bypassed the King's press office, defended their daughter with a precision that silenced the critics. "Lady Louise Windsor has neither asked for a throne nor a stage," they wrote. "She has only ever accepted responsibility when others discarded it." The message was a devastating reminder of the duty Louise had stepped into while others had chosen to walk away. On February 10th, standing on the steps of the Grey House, in the soft Highland snow, Louise delivered her final answer. The announcement, streamed live to an audience of over 9 million viewers, was not the acceptance speech the king had expected. "I am grateful for my family's trust," Louise said, her breath visible in the cold air. "But I believe duty does not require a title. For now, I remain simply Lady Louise." The refusal was a masterstroke of humility. By rejecting the title of princess, she became something far more powerful, a royal by choice, not by decree. Days later, it was confirmed that King Charles had personally written her a hand-delivered letter, a tradition not used since Queen Elizabeth II wrote to Prince William on the eve of his investiture. The letter reportedly contained a line that moved Louise to tears. "Your grandmother believed that greatness grows in silence. I now see she was speaking of you." By mid-February, a new moral axis had formed within the monarchy. On one side were those who sought the spotlight, leveraging their titles for narrative control. On the other was Lady Louise, who had declined elevation but earned universal reverence. She had inherited not just a secret estate, but the ethical foundation of the crown itself. She had endured attacks without retaliation and rejected vanity when it was easiest to accept. Even without a crown, the people began calling her the Guardian of the Grey House, proving that sometimes the most powerful inheritance isn't a title, but the courage to remain exactly who you are. As the winter of 2026 begins to fade into the memory of the British monarchy, the lesson of the Grey House remains etched into the very foundations of the Windsor family. We have witnessed a 22-year-old woman outmaneuver the most seasoned players in the palace, not through aggression or media manipulation, but through the sheer, quiet weight of her character. Lady Louise Windsor has shown the world that the most valuable part of Queen Elizabeth's life was not what she gave to the public, but what she chose to keep in the shadows for those she trusted most. This journey, which began with a shocking inheritance and a clandestine campaign by the Parker Bowles family, has ended with a fundamental truth. Real power does not require a stage. Moral authority does not require a title. By choosing to remain simply Lady Louise, she has preserved the sanctity of the Grey House and the unfiltered voice of the woman who wore the crown for 70 years. She has proven that while others might seek to rewrite history for their own convenience, there are some memories that are simply not for sale. The monarchy now stands at a crossroads, reshaped from within by a girl who refused to perform. The Quiet Years initiative has replaced the empty spectacle of modern branding, reminding us all that duty is a silent pact, not a public display. Lady Louise Windsor did not just inherit an estate, she inherited a soul. And in protecting that soul, she has saved the legacy of the crown itself. But this story leaves us with one final, haunting question. In an age where everyone is fighting to be seen, is the ultimate act of strength actually the choice